The docking officer at Kaur Reach took one look at the Kessler's margin and laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind you swallow and convert into a cough. He laughed the way something genuinely surprises you. The way a joke lands before you've decided whether it's appropriate. And then he turned to the two Vethek Keth attendants behind him and said something in Vethek that my translator had no trouble with at all. "The human has arrived in a funeral barge," he said. The attendants made the sound Vethek Keth make when they find something funny. It's a dry, clicking rattle deep in their crystalline thorax, like someone shaking a jar of quartz chips. They both did it. One of them pressed the flat of a foreleg against what I understood to be their version of a politely covered mouth. Though Vethek Keth don't have mouths in the conventional sense, just a lower jaw structure that refracts light in ways their kind read as expression. I came down the ramp with my duffel and my case of archiving equipment and stood on the docking plate in front of the three of them. "Warrant Officer 3rd Class Yemisi Adaora," I said. "Exchange posting, records, and documentation." 12-week assignment. The docking officer looked at his panel, found my entry, and looked back up at the Kessler's margin with the expression of a man reconsidering a document he'd already signed. "That vessel," he said carefully in standard, "is cleared for Kaur Reach. She's got a valid transit certificate and a current safety inspection, yes." He looked at the margin again. She was, I will grant, not much to look at from the outside. 41 years old, a long-haul courier hull, the kind of thing that was built to carry seed contracts and agricultural manifests between secondary colony worlds before those routes were consolidated and the big carriers took over. She had been repainted twice since her original commission, and neither paint job had been finished with particular care, so her hull wore a patchwork of old registry gray under newer navy, under a third layer of something closer to rust brown that I'd applied myself to the forward section 3 years prior and never gotten around to extending to the rest of her. Her sensor mast was crooked at about 7 degrees from true vertical, a result of a docking incident in the Mersenne corridor that I had repaired myself using components from a different sensor mast I'd picked up at a parts market on Indira Station. The repair was sound. The alignment was cosmetic. There was also a long seam running along her port dorsal hull where I had opened her up to install something 18 months ago, sealed the seam with 4 grades of compound, and painted over it with the rust brown. The compound was rated well past her service life. The seam was straight and tight and had not moved in 14 months of flight. But it was visible, if you were looking, as a slightly different texture in the paint. The kind of thing that tells a practiced eye that someone has been inside this hull. The docking officer was not looking at the seam. He was looking at the overall picture, which was old, battered, mismatched, and crooked. "She flies," I said, since the docking officer appeared to need reassurance on this point. "She flies," he repeated. He seemed to be processing this as a philosophical position rather than a statement of engineering fact. "I'd like to get my equipment to the records room before the afternoon shift if that's workable." He gave me my docking assignment, Bay 14, which was in the auxiliary section, which I understood was where you put vessels that you did not want near the main concourse where anyone might see them. Bay 14 was fine. It had a power coupling and a data port, and I didn't need anything else. I walked my equipment up to the records room and introduced myself to the Kaur Reach station administrator, a Vethek Keth named Evith, who had the pale, slightly translucent faceting of an elder and a manner that suggested she had been doing administrative work since before I was born and expected to continue doing it after I was dead. She showed me the records room. It was a small, well-organized space at the rear of the station's documentation sector, with wall-mounted storage, a central workbench, a data terminal with full access to the station's archival system, and a comms relay port that Evith told me ran to the station's main relay hub. "The relay port gives you open channel access to the hub," she said. "Good bandwidth for documentation transfers. The Vethek Keth research delegation uses it for transmission logs." "Understood," I said, May I use it for personal work traffic as well? She looked at me the way a senior administrator looks at you when you've asked a question that is technically permitted by the applicable regulations, but that she suspects you may be planning to do something unusual with. Within capacity limits, she said. I won't exceed them, I said. I'm working on something with a lot of iterative data passes. The bandwidth is useful. She noted it in the station log and moved on. I spent my first afternoon in the records rooms learning the filing system, which was organized according to a Keth archival convention that treated documentation by transmission date rather than subject, meaning that everything you needed was findable, but required a mental adjustment from what I was used to. By the end of the afternoon, I had it well enough to work quickly. I cross-indexed the major subjects into a reference file I kept on my personal terminal so I could pull things without hunting, which was the kind of small efficiency that makes an 8 to 10 hour documentation day tolerable. The Keth research delegation was 12 strong, led by a senior scientist whose name, transliterated, was something like Karavith Angkor, which I was told meant something approximately equivalent to third facet of the core lineage, and which I addressed as Karaveth in keeping with the informal convention the station used for foreign personnel. Karaveth was tall even by Keth standards. They run to about 2.5 meters on their extended legs, and had the deep cobalt coloration of their research cast, with facets along their dorsal structure that caught the station light and scattered it in ways I found, privately, quite beautiful. There is a quality to Keth coloration under good light that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't seen it. Not iridescent exactly, because iridescence implies surface shimmer, and this was structural, coming from inside the facets themselves, a depth of color that changed as they moved. The senior researchers in the delegation had the deepest coloration. The junior ones were lighter, more variable, with the slightly unsettled quality of people whose faces haven't finished deciding what they look like. They did not feel similarly about me. I had been told during my pre-posting briefing that Keth research delegations could be somewhat insular during active project phases. Insular was the word the liaison officer had used, carefully. The word I would have used, having now spent 48 hours in their vicinity, was sealed. They moved through the station in a tight cluster, communicated almost entirely in Vethek, even in mixed species areas, where standard was the courtesy norm, and regarded everything outside their cluster with the distant, measuring attention of people who have decided the environment is not particularly interesting, but are monitoring it in case it produces something useful. I was not expected to produce something useful. I was the records officer. I filed their transmission logs, maintained the station archive, processed documentation for the joint panel meetings, and occasionally fetched equipment forms from the supply section on the opposite end of the station. I was in the architecture of the delegation's attention, a piece of furniture. A functional one, presumably, in the same way that a well-maintained filing cabinet is functional. But furniture. There is a particular quality to being invisible in a professional setting that is different from being ignored. Being ignored is active. Someone registers your presence and decides not to engage with it. Being invisible is passive. The Keth delegation did not decide not to engage with me. They simply did not register me as the kind of thing that required engagement. When they passed me in the corridor, they did not look through me the way you look through someone you're avoiding. They looked past me the way you look past a piece of corridor equipment, with the peripheral awareness of something that is where it is supposed to be and requires no further attention. When I entered a room where they were working, the room's temperature did not change. When I left it, nothing shifted either. I was consistent, predictable, and categorically irrelevant to their project. This was not malicious. I want to be clear about that. It was simply how their model of the situation was organized. The research delegation occupied one category. The station support staff occupied another, and the records officer from the exchange program occupied a third category, somewhat below the second. Present by diplomatic formality, useful in the way that administrative machinery is useful, not a variable in any equation that mattered. This suited me entirely. I had a comms relay port with good bandwidth, a records room no one else used after 1600, and a project I'd been working on for the better part of 2 years. The project had started, as most things start, with a specific technical problem that I couldn't stop thinking about. I'd been working on propulsion efficiencies, specifically the problem of efficiency transfer across a coupled phase architecture, which is the kind of design challenge that sounds narrow until you start pulling on it, and find it connected to everything else. The core difficulty was in the coupling junction, where two-phase systems needed to hand off energy without the harmonic interference patterns that appeared at certain resonance conditions, and degraded the transfer efficiency enough to matter in a practical system. Theoretically, the interference could be designed around. In practice, every model I'd seen applied to the problem, and I'd read most of the available literature, produced the same result. The interference appeared, the efficiency dropped, and you had to choose between managing it expensively at the output stage or accepting the loss. I didn't accept the loss. I was aware that this was an unreasonable personal position to take on someone else's unsolved problem, but I'd been an unreasonable person about technical problems for my entire career, and it had occasionally paid off in small ways, so I continued. The project lived on 3 drives and a set of physical notebooks in my duffel, supplemented by whatever computing cycles I could borrow from the Kessler's margin systems while she sat in Bay 14 drawing station power and, looking presumably like a funeral barge, I had converted her navigation array into a parallel processing resource 2 years prior when I was doing heavy simulation work and needed more computing power than my portable terminal could provide. The navigation array still navigated. It also ran my simulations in the background. The margin was a tolerant vessel. I worked on the project every evening after my documentation duties were done, and sometimes in the early morning before they started. I sent packets through the relay port, design iterations, simulation results, test parameters, draft calculations, to a small group of colleagues back home who were working on adjacent problems, and most importantly, to one retired propulsion engineer named Kiyamaka Ose, who had been my mentor for 6 years and who still reviewed my work with the patient attention of someone who has decided you might eventually say something worth hearing and is prepared to wait as long as it takes for that to happen. Kiyamaka was 71 years old, had spent 30 years of her career at the Transit Authority's Propulsion Research Division, had 3 patents registered under her name and 4 more under collaborative filings, and had retired to a house on the coast of a secondary colony world where she grew food and read and corresponded with people like me. She was, in my experience, the most technically precise person I had ever met. She communicated exclusively in the first and second person singular, never used passive voice, and had once told me that unnecessary hedging in technical writing was a form of intellectual cowardice. I found her extremely useful and somewhat terrifying, and I trusted her judgment entirely. She had taken me on as a correspondent 7 years ago when I sent her a letter, an actual letter, formatted and addressed, because she had once mentioned in a published interview that she preferred real letters to message packets, and I had taken this literally, about a fuel transfer calculation in one of her published papers that I thought contained a transcription error. It did contain a transcription error. She had written back by message packet despite her stated preference to say that I was correct, that it had been in the published version for 4 years without anyone noticing, and that she found this depressing. We had been corresponding since. She had been corresponding with me about the coupling problem for 14 months. Before that, she had been listening to me describe the coupling problem for 8 months, while I worked up the nerve to ask her to look at it. "Send it," she had said eventually. "Stop rehearsing it in your head. Send the draft and I'll tell you what's wrong with it. I had sent the draft. She had told me what was wrong with it. I had revised and sent again. We had been doing this since. The work was iterative. That is almost too simple a word for what it was, but it is the accurate one. I would run a parameter set, get results, analyze the failure modes, revise the parameter set, run it again. Most of the runs were failures in the sense that they did not produce the target outcome. They were not failures in the engineering sense. They told me things. I logged what they told me and adjusted. I had been doing this for roughly 700 days. I kept a notebook for the analytical work and a separate notebook for what I called the dead ends record, which was a full account of every approach that had failed and exactly why it had failed, so I wouldn't circle back to them. The dead ends record was 3/4 full. I considered this progress. The Vethek during this period were working on their own problem. I knew this because I filed their transmission logs. I did not read the classified research files. I wasn't cleared for them, and I had no interest in crossing that line. But the transmission logs themselves, the metadata of timing and volume and flags, told a story that was not hard to read if you'd spent any time around research work. They were stuck. They had been stuck based on the log history I inherited from the previous records officer. For the better part of 8 months, the volume of outgoing transmissions had increased. The average response latency from their home institute had increased. The proportion of transmissions flagged urgent had increased, and the proportion flagged as resolved had decreased. These are not the patterns of a project going well. There is a rhythm to research communications when a project is progressing. The messages are regular but not frantic. The flags cluster around milestones. The Home Institute's responses come back at a moderate cadence, with a mixture of requests for more data and acknowledgments of progress. When a project is stuck, the rhythm changes. The outgoing messages get more frequent and more fragmented, as if the team is sending partial results, hoping something will land. The Home Institute's responses get slower, as if the institution is taking longer to process information that isn't cohering into a picture. The flag distribution shifts, more urgent, fewer resolved. Eventually, and this had happened with the Vethek delegation in the month before my arrival, based on the logs, there is a category of message that appears, which is not a results report and not a status update, but something closer to a formal inquiry about methodology, which is how an institution asks its own team, politely, whether they might be approaching the problem incorrectly. I noted this the way I noted most things about the delegation, at a distance with mild interest, without any feeling that it was my business. They had a problem. It was their problem. I had a different problem. I was working on it. On the 11th day of my posting, I was in the mess hall at the station's mid-morning break period, when 2 of the delegation's junior researchers sat down at the table adjacent to mine. They were speaking in Vethek, which is not a language I speak, but I have a reasonably good translator implant, and the mess hall was quiet, enough that it picked them up without much difficulty. I was not listening deliberately. I was eating and reading a maintenance report I'd been asked to file. The translator runs continuously. It processes ambient speech the way background noise processes, filtered, noted, and released unless something flags. Something flagged. What they said, approximately, was this. The first one said something about the morning briefing being a waste of time again, that Karaveth was cycling through the same parameter space and expecting different outputs. The second one agreed and said the third stage numbers hadn't moved in 6 weeks, and the Home Institute was beginning to ask questions that were harder to answer with a status report. The first one said at least Karaveth wasn't directing the frustration at the junior researchers yet, and the second said give it another month. Then the first one said something that my translator rendered with what I thought was admirable precision as ATS. The human archivist's ship has more computing power in its navigation array than the human archivist has in her head. The second one made the rattling sound. Stay behind humans, the first one said. The ones who went to the cosmos at least had the sense to leave. The second one clicked agreement and said something about how the exchange program was a diplomatic formality, that nobody seriously expected a records officer to contribute to anything. I finished my maintenance report and filed it. I want to be careful about how I describe my internal state in that moment, because I've been asked about it enough times since, and the honest answer is more complicated than the satisfying answer. The satisfying answer is that I wasn't bothered, that I simply noted it and moved on. That's mostly true. The more complete answer is that it landed somewhere in my chest with a small, specific weight, not anger, not hurt exactly, but the recognition that I was being seen as a category rather than a person, and that the category was one they'd already decided wasn't worth paying attention to. I knew what stay behind humans meant in the way that it was used. There's a line in the Vethet Keth thinking about humanity. I'd read about it in the pre-posting briefing materials between the humans who had expanded outward into the cosmos alongside the major species and the humans who had remained earthbound or colony proximate, the ones who had not left. The cosmos branch humans were, from the Vethet Keth perspective, the real version, the ones who had demonstrated the ambition required for the galaxy. The stay-behinds were the remainder. It is a tidy theory. I was, by its logic, the remainder. The thing I felt was not anger. It was closer to the feeling you get when you see a technical error in a document that the author is clearly very proud of. A kind of private level recognition that something is wrong in a way the person who produced it cannot yet see, combined with no particular desire to point it out immediately. The document will still be wrong later. The error will still be there. There is no urgency about correcting it. I went back to the records room and sent that evening's packet through the relay port. Kiyomaka's response came back the following morning. She had reviewed the latest simulation results and thought the phase coupling approach was the right track, but the loss coefficient at the third stage needed addressing before anything else. The third stage is hiding something, she wrote. Stop trying to optimize around it and figure out what it is. She included 3 pages of notes in her precise, close-written style, each one annotated with the line numbers she was responding to. At the end, she added the observation she made periodically, which was, "You're closer than you think you are. Don't get impatient." I was not impatient. I had, by that point, become constitutionally incapable of impatience with this particular problem. I had simply become someone who worked on it. The third stage loss was, as it happened, something I had been thinking about for longer than I had admitted in my most recent draft. There was a behavior in the simulations that I kept attributing to parameter noise. A small variance at the output stage of the coupling sequence that appeared in roughly 1 run in 8, and that I had been treating as an artifact of the simulation resolution rather than a real phenomenon. Kiyomaka's note pushed me back to those runs. I pulled the flagged instances and put them on a separate tracking sheet and looked at them for a long time. They had a pattern. The variance was not random. It was associated with specific input conditions, a narrow band of coupling geometry, parameters that I had been treating as a dead end and routing around rather than through. I wrote to Kiyomaka, "I think I've been avoiding the third stage numbers because they were making the model harder. And I told myself it was because they were unreliable." She wrote back, "Yes, now do the work." I did the work. It took 11 days of evenings, routed through the relay port in packets that went to Kiyomaka and back with her annotations, accumulating into a revised model that I rebuilt from the coupling junction outward, rather than from the output stage inward. The Vethet Keth, during those 11 days, continued their work in the research section. I continued filing their transmission logs. The patterns held: high volume, urgent flags, increasing latency in the Home Institute's responses. The Thursday joint panel meeting of my 3rd week introduced a new element, an external review of the delegation's progress, requested by the Home Institute, scheduled for 6 weeks hence. A full technical brief would be required. I noted this in the meeting summary. I filed the meeting summary. I went back to the records room and continued working. Karavith received the review deadline with the controlled stillness of someone absorbing an impact they had been braced for. I watched this from my seat at the end of the table and found nothing to note in the summary beyond the bare fact of the announcement and the brief discussion of timeline and scope that followed. The summary did not include my observations about Karavith's posture or the quality of the silence after the review deadline was stated. That was not what summaries were for. Harlow, the human liaison officer, stopped in the records room doorway after the meeting. He had the look of a man who has been assigned to a posting that keeps developing new ways of being unproductive and is running low on philosophical resources for absorbing this. "Third week," he said. "Third week," I agreed. He looked at the relay port and the stack of drives on my workbench. "What's the project?" "Propulsion efficiency, coupling geometry." He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has understood the words without necessarily having a detailed picture of the content. "How's it going?" "Better than last week," I said. He seemed to find this satisfying in some vague way, and went on. The Thursday meeting settled into a rhythm. I prepared the documentation package, attended, took the notes, produced the summary, filed it. The joint panel was not a technical session. Classified research details were not discussed there, only general progress status, timeline logistics, and procedural matters. But general progress status, if you listened carefully, told a story. The story the Vetheketh progress reports were telling was, we are working very hard on a difficult problem, and the difficult problem is not yet solved. I listened and noted and said nothing. I was the records officer. My job was to record, not to interpret. On the evening of my 5th week, I ran a simulation that came back different. Not dramatically different. Nothing in this kind of work announces itself with fanfare. There are no alarms, no notifications, no visual display that does something impressive. There is just a result window and numbers in it, and the process of reading those numbers and comparing them to the numbers you expected to get. Most of the time, the numbers are the numbers you expected. Sometimes they are worse. Occasionally, they are better in small, incremental ways that you note and adjust toward. This result was different in a way that made me read it a second time, and then a third time, and then set down my stylus and look at the wall for a moment. The phase coupling loss coefficient at the third stage had dropped by a factor that should not have been accessible from the parameter set I had used. I went back through the run log to find the error, the wrong input value, the misconfigured parameter, the simulation artifact that was producing a spurious good result. I found nothing. The run was clean. The inputs were exactly what I'd set. The result was real. I sat in the records room for a while after the station lights had cycled down for the evening shift, looking at the result on my terminal with the particular quality of attention that comes when you have been wrong about something for a long time and are only now beginning to understand what the correct framing is. I sent Kiyamaka a packet that was longer than usual and went to bed. Her response came back the next morning while I was eating breakfast. It was 3 words, run it again. I ran it again during my lunch gap, using the same parameters set. Same result within measurement tolerance. I sent her the output. Her next response was longer. She wanted the full parameter set, the complete run log, the failure records from the previous 8 months of third stage anomalies, and the results of 2 variant configurations she specified. She also wanted to know if I had done what she thought I had done, which was to route a segment of the coupling geometry through a parameter band. She had flagged in a note 3 months prior that I had subsequently marked as a dead end. I had, in fact, routed through that band. I had done it not because I'd returned to her flagged note, but because my own revised model had pointed me in the same direction. I told her this. Good, she said. That means you arrived there on the merits, not because I told you to. Run the variants. I ran the variants over the following 2 days, routing the results through the relay port in batches that went out in the morning, and came back with her annotations in the evening. The records room was very quiet in the evenings. The station's ventilation system made a faint sound like a river in the walls. I worked at the bench and the terminal and the relay port, built its stack of packets and acknowledgements that no one else was looking at. Kiyomaka's full assessment came back on a Friday evening when I had a slight headache from a long notation session and had been expecting more questions rather than a conclusion. I have remembered the message carefully for reasons that will become clear. The loss mechanism is the coupling geometry, not the phase interval. You've been solving the wrong subproblem for 7 months. The geometry fix works because it eliminates the harmonic interference at the input stage. That's why the third stage numbers look like magic. They're not magic. You removed the thing that was making them bad. The rest of the optimization is straightforward from here. You have the hard part. I want the full geometry spec when you've written it up. Don't rush the write-up. I sat with that for longer than I usually sit with things. The geometry fix. The coupling junction's geometry, the physical shape of the interface between the two phase systems, was creating a condition at the input stage that generated the harmonic interference I'd been trying to manage downstream. I hadn't been solving the coupling problem. I had been managing the symptom of the geometry problem while leaving the geometry problem alone because the geometry problem was harder. Every model I'd seen applied to the coupling junction had treated the geometry as a fixed variable, an engineering constraint, and worked around it. The interference was just something you dealt with. Except it wasn't. You dealt with it because you assumed the geometry was fixed. If the geometry was a variable, if you designed the junction shape specifically to eliminate the harmonic condition rather than designing around it, the interference didn't appear. The third stage ran clean. The loss coefficient dropped to where the model said it could theoretically be. I looked at the Kessler's margins technical schematic, which I kept on one of my drives, the port dorsal seam, the modified drive compartment, 14 months of flight data. I had installed the prototype geometry fix in the margin 18 months ago. At the time, I had thought of it as an experimental variant, a modified coupling junction that I'd machined to a non-standard profile and installed, because I wanted to see what happened in service conditions, not because I fully understood why it should work. I understood now. I had built the fix before I understood the theory. The theory had been catching up to the hardware for 14 months. I drafted the write-up carefully over the following week. I sent sections to Kiyomaka in the evenings and incorporated her feedback before moving on. She was a precise editor. "This sentence is doing 2 things and doing both of them badly," she would say, and she would be right, and I would fix it. The write-up built the theoretical foundation first, then the geometry specification, then the experimental design, then the test data from the margin's 14 months of operational use. The test data was extensive. I had been logging it meticulously from the day of installation because I had not been certain the fix would hold, and I had wanted a full record of what happened if it failed. It had not failed. The record showed exactly what it showed. A coupling junction operating at the theoretical efficiency ceiling, cleanly, consistently, across a range of conditions. I routed the write-up sections through the relay port at the records room. Good bandwidth. The Keth delegation during this week was also having a week. It was not a good one. The transmission logs showed very high volume, urgent flags at a proportion I had not seen before in the posting, and a pattern of send-receive timing that suggested the Home Institute was in internal discussion between transmissions, multiple responses to single outgoing packets, gap lengths consistent with a committee rather than a single correspondent. The external review was 4 weeks away. The Thursday meeting was tense in the quiet, refracted way of Keth tension, which is different from human tension but readable once you've been around it for a few weeks. The facets pulling in slightly. The dorsal structure held unusually still. The light scattering that functions as their expression running in flatter, less varied patterns. I took the meeting notes and produced the summary and filed it. I was in the records room on the Tuesday of my 6th week, working on the field validation section of the write-up. when I looked at the clock and realized I had 40 minutes before the Thursday joint panel. Documentation package was due for pickup. Thursday was tomorrow. I had not started the documentation package. I spent the next 40 minutes doing this efficiently, which is one of the advantages of being organized. When you need to move quickly, there is no time lost to finding things. Harlow picked it up on Thursday morning, glanced at the agenda, and said, "Difficult morning ahead. I'll have the summary done by end of day," I said. He nodded and went on. The briefing room for the Thursday joint panel meeting was the station's main chamber, a larger space than the records room, with a long oval table, a ceiling display array for projected materials, and a comms audio panel on the wall near the door that connected to the station's main relay hub. The comms panel had a small indicator light. Green meant the room's audio was patched into the open relay. Amber meant the room was on the closed research channel. Dark meant the room was isolated. The indicator was supposed to be dark during all joint panel sessions, as a matter of routine protocol. The comms officer confirmed isolation at the start of every meeting I had attended. This was not a classified meeting. The joint panel did not discuss classified research, but the isolation protocol applied regardless, to keep the meeting audio off the general relay traffic. I noticed, when I came in with my notation equipment and settled at the end of the table, that the indicator was green. I considered this for a moment. The meeting was not classified. Nothing in today's agenda was sensitive. The green indicator meant the audio was running on the open administrative relay, which at this hour on a Thursday morning was being used primarily by me and by the station's documentation transfer system, neither of which was paying attention to meeting audio. The likelihood that anyone outside the station was on the other end of that particular relay channel at this moment was approximately 0. I decided it was not my place to interrupt the setup process. I was the records officer. If there were a comms protocol deviation, it was the comms officer's concern to catch. The meeting opened with Karaveth's status summary. I took notes. The station authority representatives asked about the review timeline. I took notes. Harlow asked a clarifying question about the external panel's composition. I took notes. Then Karaveth moved to the technical agenda item that had been sitting at the center of the delegation's work for 8 months, and described it, in general terms, for the benefit of the station authority representatives who were not cleared for the specifics. The problem, Karaveth said, was in efficiency transfer across a coupled phase propulsion architecture. They had been working on a specific challenge in the coupling junction, a harmonic interference pattern that appeared at certain resonance conditions in the input stage and propagated through the system in ways that degraded transfer efficiency below the threshold required for their application. They had approached this from 5 different angles over 8 months. All 5 approaches had produced useful data. None had produced a solution. The geometry of the coupling junction was the central difficulty. Every model they applied to it produced the same harmonic interference at the input stage, which degraded third-stage efficiency below the required threshold. I set down my stylus, the coupling junction, the harmonic interference at the input stage, the third-stage loss, the geometry. I picked my stylus back up. I continued taking notes. The meeting ran for approximately 90 minutes. The station authority representatives asked questions. Harlow asked questions. I wrote down what everyone said and did not contribute to the discussion, which was not my role. The technical detail remained in the general register appropriate for a mixed clearance meeting. Karaveth was careful about the specifics, but the shape of the problem was clear enough in the general description that I understood exactly what they were talking about. I understood it because I had been solving it. Not the same application, not the same engineering context, not even the same scale, but the core problem, the coupling geometry, the harmonic interference at the input stage, the third stage loss, the 5 approaches that had produced data without producing a solution, was, in its essential structure, the thing that Kiyamaka and I had spent 700 days working on, and had, as of 11 days prior, solved. The geometry fix was in the write-up I'd been sending through the relay port. The relay port that was, this morning, patched into the open administrative relay. The open administrative relay that was currently carrying the audio of the meeting I was sitting in. I looked at the indicator light on the comms panel. It was still green. It had been green for 90 minutes. I finished my notes. The meeting concluded. Karavith and the senior researchers gathered their materials and exchanged a few words in Vethek, flat and tired sounding, before filing out. The station authority representatives followed. Harlow caught my eye on his way to the door with an expression that said nothing, had been resolved, and he had not expected it to be. I stayed behind to collect the physical materials left on the table, which was part of my records function. I was doing this when the comms panel on the wall chimed, and the indicator light shifted from green to amber. The comms officer's voice came through. "Records room, this is comms. I've just noticed the main briefing room was on open relay for your morning session. I had a routing error on my board. Nothing classified went out, was it?" "No classified content," I said. "General technical discussion only." "Right. Apologies. I'll have it corrected." "Thank you," I said. I gathered the last of the table materials and went back to the records room. The final section of the write-up was the field validation summary from the Kessler's Margin's 14 months of operational data. I had been holding it until Kiyamaka approved the geometry spec. Her approval had come through the previous evening. I formatted the validation summary that afternoon between documentation tasks in the standard package structure I used for archiving purposes. I sent Kiyamaka a final note when it was done. She responded within the hour. The summary was clean. The test data presentation was accurate. The interpretation was correct. I saved the complete write-up to the project drives and labeled it with the date. Then I went to the mess hall for dinner, ate a plate of rice and vegetables that the station kitchen produced with the reliable mediocrity that all station kitchens achieve, and read several chapters of the book I'd brought from home, and went to bed. The comms request from Karaveth arrived the next morning, before my first documentation task. In 6 weeks, Karaveth had addressed me directly exactly twice. Once on my first day, confirming my clearance level with the brisk efficiency of someone verifying that a piece of equipment is the correct voltage, and once when they needed a transmission log pulled on short notice. Both interactions had lasted under 2 minutes. The request was for a meeting. Within the hour, the research section's small internal briefing room, not the joint panel chamber. I confirmed and went. The small briefing room held Karaveth and 2 of the senior researchers, the ones I had come to know from the transmission logs and the meeting records as Revith Ka and Soluith. They were standing, which was their preference. They had the quality of careful, focused attention that I recognized as different from their usual distant monitoring. Not the monitoring of furniture. Something more directed. On the table was a terminal displaying something I recognized. It was a partial capture of that morning's meeting audio, time-stamped, alongside a packet transcript in the station's standard administrative format, source-coded to the records room relay port. They had pulled the relay logs. They had matched the meeting audio to the outgoing packet traffic from the records room. They had done this quickly and carefully. Karavith looked at me and said, in very precise standard, "Warrant Officer Adoora, this packet traffic from your relay port. Would you explain what it contains?" It was not quite a question. It had the grammatical shape of a question and the social weight of a summons. I looked at the terminal. I looked at Karavith. "It's a propulsion efficiency study," I said. "I've been working on it for about 2 years." A silence. "The coupling geometry problem described in this traffic," Karavith said, with the deliberate care of someone choosing words in a second language under pressure, "is relevant to a problem our delegation has been studying." "I noticed," I said. Another silence. This one had a different texture. In the first silence, they had been processing what I'd said. In this one, I had the distinct impression that they were revising something fundamental. Not a specific fact, but a working assumption. the kind that sits so far beneath the rest of your thinking that you don't notice it's there until it starts to shift. The revision appeared to require time. "Your vessel," Revithka said. It was the first time one of the junior researchers had spoken to me directly in 6 weeks. "The Kessler's margin. Yes, it carries a prototype installation of this geometry. Yes, I installed it 18 months ago and flew it for 4 months of testing before the posting. 14 months of field data total." Solueth made a sound that my translator flagged as nonverbal and declined to render. It was not the rattling laughter I had heard in the mess hall. It was something else, smaller and less structured. The sound of a mental model cracking under a load it hadn't been built to carry. Karavith was very still for a moment. The facets along their dorsal structure held the briefing room light without scattering it, which I had come to understand as a sign of concentrated internal attention. "How long have you been working on this problem?" Karavith asked. "The core problem?" "About 700 days. The geometry fix specifically, 8 months of focused work. The installation on the margin was once I had a version I was confident enough to test in service conditions." "You said you installed it yourself." "Yes, over 3 weekends at Indira Station. Borrowed tools from a mechanic I know there. Wrote the installation manual as I went, because there was no existing manual. Because I was doing something that hadn't been done before in this configuration." "Yes. And the field validation?" 14 months. I've been logging the operational data from the installation since I put it in. The efficiency numbers matched the theoretical model within measurement tolerance." Karavith looked at the terminal display again, at the timestamps, at the packet sizes. They were doing arithmetic, I realized, mentally working out what 14 months of logged operational data implied about when I had started, what the relay traffic volume implied about the pace of the work, what the scope of the write-up implied about its stage of completion. They were trying to construct a timeline that made sense from the inside out, the way you reconstruct a history from evidence when the initial account turns out to be incomplete. "You have been conducting this research," Karavith said, "for the entirety of your posting here, and for approximately 2 years before the posting." "Yes. While performing your documentation duties. In the evenings and early mornings, mostly. The relay port in the records room has good bandwidth, and the bandwidth you were using was the open administrative relay, the same channel that carried your meeting audio this morning when the comms officer had a routing error." Another silence. Revethka and Solueth were very still. I had the impression that the 3 of them were communicating something to each other in the subtle light, scattering register of their expression that I could not read. Some shared processing of the situation that was happening faster than their spoken exchange. "You are," Karavith said carefully, "the documentation records officer for this exchange posting. Warrant officer 3rd class. Records and documentation, yes. This is not documentation work. No, it's a personal project. You have been conducting this research, routing this packet traffic through the station's open administrative relay for the duration of your posting." "Yes, good bandwidth." Revithka made a sound. Solueth made a different sound. Karavith remained very still. I thought about what the 2 junior researchers had said in the mess hall 5 weeks ago. The ones who went to the cosmos had at least the sense to leave. I thought about Bay 14 in the auxiliary section, where you put vessels you don't want near the main concourse. I thought about the docking officer looking at the Kessler's margin and saying to the people behind him that the human had arrived in a funeral barge. I thought about Shiamaka, 71 years old, in her house on the coast, who had been reviewing my work with patient attention for 14 months, and who had written to me 3 months ago, "You're closer than you think you are." I thought about the port dorsal seam on the margin, the one that ran in a slightly different texture through the rust-brown paint, straight and tight and 14 months untouched because the thing beneath it worked. I had laid that seam myself with borrowed tools and a manual I wrote as I went, and I had done it that way because there was no other way to do it. because the work I was doing had not been done before, and there were no instructions for it except the ones the problem itself eventually provided if you stayed with it long enough. This is, in my experience, how most things actually get built, not in the well-funded research sections, not by the delegations with the home institutes and the external review panels, by people who found a problem they couldn't stop thinking about and stayed with it in the evenings and the early mornings and in relay port packets to a retired engineer on a distant coast until the problem eventually told them what it was. The Cosmos branch had left. The stay-behinds had remained. And somewhere in the difference between those two choices, in the gap between the people who reached outward and the people who stayed and worked on what was in front of them, there was a 41-year-old courier with a crooked sensor mast that flew very well. The field data from the margin, Karaveth said. Is it available in a format that could be reviewed? I have a formatted validation summary. Full operational dataset, 14 months. Standard documentation package structure. I can have it in your queue by end of shift. Revithka made the sound again. Soluith looked at the terminal and looked at me and looked at the terminal. End of shift, Karaveth said. End of shift, I said. I went back to the records room and loaded the validation summary into the delegation's documentation queue, and then went back to filing the transmission logs from the morning's joint panel session, which were due before 1700. Harlow stopped by around 1500. He stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who has received information that has reorganized the room he thought he was standing in. The delegation's research section sent a comms to the Home Institute an hour ago, he said. Marked urgent, different kind of urgent. Not distress urgent, something else. I said. He was quiet. He looked at the relay port and the stack of project drives on the corner of my workbench. Your propulsion project, I said. Yes, and the ship. Test bed, 14 months. He absorbed this. He looked at the door to the corridor, then back at the workbench, then at me. The sensor mast, he said. Cosmetic, I said. The alignment doesn't affect the installation. He stood there for another few seconds. Then he made the compressed, wry exhalation of a man who has just understood a joke that arrived at a significant delay from its setup, and nodded once and left. I finished the transmission logs at 16:30 and filed them. Then I went to the mess hall and had tea and looked out the viewport at the approach corridor where the Kessler's margin had come in 6 weeks ago, mismatched and battered and crooked, and was noted as a funeral barge by people who had decided before she docked that there was nothing worth looking at. The external review, 6 weeks later, went well. I was not present for it. It was a closed session between the delegation and the Home Institute's external panel, but Harlow told me afterward that the technical brief had been received with what the Vethik Keth station records described as substantial and unexpected interest. The Home Institute requested a formal documentation package on the geometry study within 2 weeks. The package was credited to its authors. Kiyamaka received a formal inquiry from a Vethik Keth Research Institute. She sent me a 3-sentence message about it. They wrote to me, I wrote back. I told them to talk to you first. Then, after a pause that lasted long enough that I had gone to sleep and woken up, well done. The Vethik Keth have a formal record filing practice for what they call revised premises, an official acknowledgement, entered into the station record, that a prior assumption has been updated in light of new evidence. It is not the same as an apology in the human sense. It is not performed. It is not emotional. It is not a statement about regret or remorse. It is a correction to the shared record. The assumption was entered as data. The data was found to be incorrect. The correction is filed so that the error does not propagate into future decisions. It has, when I read it for the first time in the station archive, the clean functional quality of a well-maintained log. Karaveth submitted one to the station authority the morning after the field validation. Summary was delivered. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph established that the delegation had held an assumption about the research Capabilities of the exchange station's documentation officer that was not supported by the available evidence. The second paragraph noted that this assumption had been corrected in light of subsequent information. The third paragraph requested that the corrected premise be noted in the station record so that it would be available to future exchange delegations as reference data. I filed it in the archive, cross-indexed under Documentation Officer Posting Records and under the Vethek Keth delegation files, and noted its filing timestamp in the log. My 12-week posting ended on a Tuesday, which was the least interesting day of the week for endings, but there it was. I packed my archiving equipment and my project drives and my notebooks into my duffel and my case and carried them down to Bay 14. The Kessler's margin sat in her spot exactly as she had sat for 12 weeks. Patchwork hull, crooked sensor mast, rust-brown forward section, the slight texture difference in the paint along the port dorsal seam. She had drawn station power from the coupling in the wall every day of the posting, and she looked exactly like what she looked like, which was an old courier that had been repainted twice badly and flown for 41 years. The docking officer for the morning shift in Bay 14 was a younger Vethek Keth than the one who had received me. Her facets had the pale, not yet set quality of someone relatively new to the job. She was processing my departure documentation when she looked at the margin with what I read as genuine curiosity, the straightforward kind, without agenda. "This is your vessel," she said. How old is she?" 41 years. "And she still flies." "She flies very well," I said. The documentation officer processed my clearance and handed me back my transit permit with a small, standard courtesy gesture and looked at the margin one more time with the same uncomplicated interest. "Safe travels," she said. "Thank you," I said. I walked up the ramp. The margin's interior smelled the way she always smells. Recycled air and metal, and the faint chemical signature of the drive installation's sealant compound, which still off-gasses a trace after 14 months in service. I had never bothered to eliminate the smell entirely. It had become familiar in the way that the things you've built yourself become familiar, a sensory record of the work. I ran my pre-departure checks. The installation read nominal on every parameter. The efficiency numbers sat where they always sat, cleanly inside the operational envelope, doing what the theory said they would do. I filed my departure notice with station control and waited for clearance. While I waited, I opened a message to Kiyamaka and typed, "Leaving Kaur Reach. The write-up is finished. Ready to proceed to the next stage when you are." Her response came back before my clearance did. "About time," she said. "I've been ready." Station control released me. I powered the margin up through her startup sequence, listening to her sounds, the particular thrum of the drive systems cycling through their power levels, the short harmonic that sits at the third stage of the coupling sequence, which used to be a roughness and is now, since the installation, something closer to a chord. It is the sound of a problem solved and built into the bones of an old ship and flown across 14 months of transit, routes and short hops, and one 12-week exchange posting at a research station in Kaur Reach, where she had spent the duration in Bay 14. In the auxiliary section, looked at once on arrival and not again after that. I took her out of Bay 14 and through the docking approach lane and out into the transit corridor that led away from Kaur Reach toward the deep run routes home. The sensor mast was still 7 degrees off true vertical. I had at some point during the posting stopped noticing it. I set my course and let her run,